Have you ever wondered why being kind feels so exhausting? Why your willingness to help, to listen, to stay patient often ends with you being the most easily forgotten person in the room? Since childhood, we were taught that a good person yields, causes no trouble, always smiles, and speaks softly. But the older we grow, the smaller we feel within those very expectations. We trade clarity for comfort. We trade our inner voice for approval. And over time, what we call kindness becomes an excuse for others to overstep, to exploit, and to dismiss us. Stoicism doesn't teach us to be obedient. It teaches us to be honest, to have boundaries, and not to be ruled by the fear of rejection. This message is not meant to make you rebel, nor to turn you cold. It simply invites you back to one quiet truth: to live in alignment with who you are, without noise, without permission, without needing to be liked to know you're on the right path. 1. Don't confuse gentleness with virtue. There is a quiet but persistent confusion in many minds. The belief that to be a good person, one must always be gentle, always agreeable, always soft in every situation. That kindness means saying yes to everything, that refusal is selfish, that expressing one's own views is disruptive, and that silence is the only way to maintain peace. But Stoic philosophy never taught such things. Virtue, one of Stoicism's 4 cardinal pillars, is not outward softness, but inner strength, unmoved by emotions or the judgment of others. Virtue is the resolve to do what is right, even if that makes us unpopular or misunderstood. Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic emperor who ruled over a chaotic empire, once wrote, "Don't waste time arguing what a good person should be. Be one." It's a powerful reminder that morality isn't about performing goodness for praise, but about how we live when no one is watching, when no one is scoring us. A virtuous person needs no validation. They don't do what's right for applause, nor avoid hardship just to be liked. They simply do what is right because it is right. But unfortunately, in today's education and social systems, the concept of a good person is often tied to the image of one who is so gentle they erase themselves. Since childhood, we are praised for being obedient, for complying, for yielding, for not bothering the adults. We learn to stay silent when ignored, to smile when treated unfairly, to put our needs second, all to earn the label of a good child. But no one tells us that this obedience, if carried into adulthood, becomes a burden. It makes us trade clarity for comfort, our inner voice for outside approval, and ourselves for a false sense of safety in the eyes of others. Stoicism does not teach us to always smile and endure. On the contrary, it teaches us to live with principles, to speak truthfully, and to preserve our dignity, even when it's not welcomed. A Stoic may be quiet, but their quiet comes from strength, not fear. They can say no to helping if it means betraying their reason or their values. They can speak up when necessary, without letting conflict disturb their composure, but also without letting compromise erase their stance. Virtue is not about pleasing everyone. Virtue is about holding your integrity in every circumstance. A gentle person may endure, but a virtuous one knows when to say, "That's enough." A gentle person may avoid conflict, but a virtuous one dares to face discomfort to protect what is right. The difference lies here. One avoids out of fear, the other acts out of clarity. Seneca once warned that he who always tries to be good among the wicked paves the way to his own destruction. It's a wake-up call, because if you live gently in an unjust world, you will be swept away. Not because you lack value, but because you never showed others that your value was worth defending. When you show no boundaries, others see it as an invitation to cross them. When you endure without response, they assume you have nothing to lose. And when you're too afraid to lose approval, you become easy to control through that very fear. A Stoic does not seek to stand out, but they do not allow themselves to be erased. They do not live to please the crowd, but to remain true to themselves. And if integrity causes others to dislike you, so be it. Self-respect does not come from approval, but from living in accordance with reason, with dignity, with inner peace. The gentle may be forgotten, but the virtuous always leave a mark, not because they are loud, but because they are clear. So, if you've ever confused being nice with being moral, now is the time to reconsider. You don't need to be agreeable in everyone's eyes. You just need to be someone you can respect when you face the mirror. Gentleness might win temporary affection, but only virtue gives lasting strength. And in a chaotic world, that is the most precious thing you can hold on to. 2. Kindness is not weakness. Kindness is a beautiful quality, but when placed without care or clear limits, it is often misunderstood, taken advantage of, or worse, mistaken for weakness. Some of us, from an early age, learn to yield in order to be loved, to be patient in order to be praised, to sacrifice in order to be accepted. We were taught that kindness means saying yes often, not making others uncomfortable, always placing our needs second to accommodate the emotions of others. And so we grew up with an unspoken belief: the kinder we are, the more we'll be recognized. But then we begin to realize, the more we give, the more we're dismissed, the more available we are, the more we're taken for granted, and the more agreeable we become, the easier we are to forget. This isn't because we aren't good enough. It's because we've misunderstood the meaning of goodness. Stoicism never defined virtue as self-erasure, nor equated kindness with letting others walk over us without resistance. On the contrary, Stoic philosophers always emphasized that virtue must be accompanied by reason, by boundaries, and by self-control. Kindness only has value when it arises from conscious choice, not from the habit of pleasing others. Kindness doesn't need to be broadcasted, but it must be defended from the hands that endlessly reach without ever knowing when to stop. Seneca once warned, "No one should lose themselves in serving others. That is not humility, it is betrayal." If you say yes to everything not out of agreement, but out of fear, your kindness is no longer noble. It becomes surrender. When you help not from will, but from pressure, when you listen not from respect, but from fear of disapproval, you're trading your identity for a fake peace. And sooner or later, that peace becomes a trap in which you no longer know who you are, what you want, or where your final limits lie. Kindness does not mean not knowing how to say no. It doesn't mean allowing others to control your time, emotions, and energy whenever they wish. A truly kind person knows when to refuse, when to stay silent, when to stand up for themselves, without hostility. Because if your kindness only exists when others are pleased, you're not being kind. You're being held hostage by others' emotions. And if you're willing to erase yourself just to keep the peace, that peace isn't peace. It's surrender. Stoic philosophy teaches us, you don't need to be soft to be good. You need to be clear. You need to have a backbone. You need to be like rock amid storm. Because the world is not always fair, and unconditional kindness, even when born from sincerity, can become fertile ground for the selfish to exploit. What you need is not to change your goodness, but to place it rightly, in the right place for the right people, at the right time. And to do that, you must have the reason to observe, the courage to refuse, and the strength to keep a part of yourself that no one else has the right to touch. Reflect on the times you said yes when you wanted to say no. The times you stayed because you feared judgment, the times you helped in silence, but with resentment in your heart. In those moments, you were not being kind. You were lying to yourself. Kindness wasn't meant for you to endure. It was meant for you to act with understanding. And if a kind act leaves you wounded, conflicted, or robbed of your peace, then it's no longer kindness, it's weakness. A Stoic does not live to please everyone. They live not to betray reason. They are not afraid of being misunderstood if it helps them stay true to principle. And they do not yield blindly, because they know this. When kindness has no limits, it will be exploited. Not because others are evil, but because you never set boundaries. That's not morality. That's negligence. So if you've ever felt your kindness was taken lightly, don't rush to blame the world. Ask yourself, have you practiced kindness consciously? Or have you been doing everything just to avoid guilt? Are you helping others, or are you helping yourself maintain the image of a good person? That's where the difference lies. One comes from freedom, the other from fear. And in the end, you don't need to change your kind nature. You just need to add one thing: clarity. Clarity about your values, clarity about your limits, and clarity that kindness is not about bowing your head. It's about standing firm, with an open heart and a discerning mind. 3. People don't respect what they aren't afraid to lose. One of the simplest yet hardest truths to accept is this: people don't respect what they assume will always be there, no matter how they treat it. Presence without boundaries, without consequence, without weight, sooner or later becomes taken for granted. And once someone becomes given in another's eyes, they're no longer seen as a human with intrinsic worth, but as a convenience, a tool, a familiar thing available on demand, without thought. You might be the one who's always there to help, always willing to listen, always sacrificing your time and needs for others. You may believe that this earns their appreciation, their affection, their desire to keep you in their lives. But reality is harsher than you think. When you're always available, they'll assume it. When you always say yes, they'll stop asking. When you're always present, they'll forget you have limits. And one day, when you're tired, when you pull back, when you fall silent, what you receive won't be gratitude, but shock, even resentment. Why? Because you taught them that. Not through words, but through repeated behavior. You trained those around you that you aren't someone to be considered or respected. You're someone who always agrees, always compromises, always carries the heavy part. And when someone doesn't have to pay for what they receive, they forget the value of what they're getting. This isn't always out of malice. It's a natural function of the human mind. What's always available is always undervalued. What sets no boundary will be overrun. What can't be lost doesn't need to be protected. The Stoics understood this centuries ago. Marcus Aurelius never sought affection. He ruled with calm, with inner discipline, and with a presence that carried weight. He never let others decide his worth. He didn't bend to be liked or soften to be accepted, because he knew this. To be respected, you must carry something that makes others pause before crossing a line. Not a threat, but a natural consequence of living with clarity and resolve. When you set no boundaries, the world will place you beneath your true worth. When you fear saying no, you're teaching others that their desires matter more than your peace. And when you constantly try to be pleasant, you're sending a dangerous message. I come with no consequence. I'm not someone worth guarding. I'll always be here, no matter how you treat me. And from that, you slowly become invisible. Respect doesn't come from kindness. It comes from clarity. It comes from the way you make people feel they must think, must measure, must adjust before acting toward you. You don't need to be cold, but you do need to carry weight. You don't need to speak loudly, but your words must carry meaning. And that only happens when you step out of the people-pleaser role and become a person with principles, with limits, with self-respect. Epictetus once said, "You cannot control others, but you can control how you show up." And how you show up, how you live, how you draw boundaries, is exactly how you teach people how they're allowed to treat you. A person who comes with no consequence carries no weight. A person without clear refusal has no clear presence. And in the real world, obscurity leads to being forgotten. You can choose to live inoffensively, but you must accept that few will truly think of you. But if you live with boundaries, with voice, with gravity, others will take pause. They may not always like you, but they will respect you. And in a world full of noise, that silent respect is worth far more than shallow affection. So ask yourself, does your kindness carry weight, or is it simply an invitation to be assumed? Does your presence create space, or is it dissolved into others' needs? And what are you truly seeking? To be liked, or to never be overlooked? For the Stoic, the answer is always clear. You don't need to be liked, but you must be respected. And respect doesn't come from being easy. It comes from being irreplaceable. 4. True strength is never loud. In a world where noise is often mistaken for power, where the loudest voice is assumed right, and where presence is confused with performance, maintaining calm can be seen as weakness, but the Stoics would disagree. To them, real strength is not in volume, not in dominance, not in instilling fear, it's in self-mastery. The less a person needs to shout, the less they feel the urge to prove themselves through words, the more their presence commands attention. Because silence rooted in inner stability can quiet a room, while loud words simply teach people to tune you out. Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher king, once wrote, "Be like the rock that the waves keep crashing over. It stands unmoved, and the raging of the sea falls still around it." That is the highest symbol of Stoic strength. Not the power to react, but the power to endure. Not the strength to win arguments, but the strength to avoid being dragged into them. Not the strength to control others, but the strength to govern oneself. In modern culture, we're often taught that to be heard, we must speak loudly. That to earn respect, we must display ourselves boldly. But true strength doesn't need to impress. It doesn't need to be recognized. It doesn't seek validation from the outside. It is simply a quiet presence that cannot be dismissed. A person with a firm core, clear principles, and deep inner control. They don't need to raise their voice to be seen. The clarity in their eyes, the certainty in their actions, the calm in their refusals, these speak for themselves. Epictetus, once a slave, knew better than anyone the limits of external power. He taught, "You cannot control what others say, but you can control how you respond." When someone attacks, insults, or provokes you, what they truly want isn't victory, it's your reaction. And every time you lose your temper, you show them you lack control over yourself. Every time you must shout to be heard, you're admitting your words carry no weight unless wrapped in noise. The Stoic doesn't argue to win. They don't react to protect their ego. They choose calm as a way of life, not because they tolerate everything, but because they know what's worth their energy and what isn't. They don't let emotion steer them. Reason is their compass, And that creates a kind of power that isn't swayed by praise or shaken by slander. A power that isn't pulled into battles that offer no value. A truly strong person is one who can stay silent when misunderstood, smile when provoked, say no without explanation, and walk away without bitterness. They don't need to declare their worth. Their worth is visible in how they live, how they act, how they set boundaries. The more someone needs to talk about themselves, the less secure they are. But the one who knows who they are, why they live as they do, their every move carries weight, even if they never say a word. The Stoics' silence is not surrender. It's a conscious choice. They don't stay quiet because they lack the courage to speak, but because they don't need to. And that restraint gives their words power when they do speak. Someone who talks too much devalues their own words. Someone who knows when to stay silent. Every sentence they utter hits with precision. We live in an age where everyone has a microphone, a platform, a constant invitation to speak up. But not every voice carries wisdom, and not every silence signals defeat. Some remain quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because they know what's worth saying, and what is better left in peace. 5. Boundaries are a sign of self-respect, not selfishness. To many, saying no, declining or setting limits is labeled as selfish, cold, or lacking compassion. They believe a kind person must always be available, always gentle, always self-sacrificing. But the truth is the opposite. A person without boundaries is not kind. They are simply giving up their self-respect to please others. A Stoic would never live that way. To them, setting boundaries is not a rejection of others. It is a recognition of one's own worth. Boundaries don't separate you from the world. They protect the most valuable part of you from being worn down. When you say, enough, you're not hurting anyone. You're declaring that your peace matters. When you decline an invitation, a responsibility that's not yours, or a relationship that causes harm, you are not being selfish. You are caring for the reason, the principles, and the core of who you are. A person without boundaries is like a house with its doors always open. Anyone can come in, stay as long as they like, rummage through everything, make a mess, and leave. And eventually, it's you who must clean up the damage that only you allowed to happen. Seneca once said, "No one is more miserable than those who cannot face adversity, for they have no chance to prove themselves." This wisdom applies not only to great trials, but also to everyday collisions, where you must choose between keeping the peace or keeping your dignity. And most people today choose peace, not out of nobility, but out of fear of being judged. They fear being called difficult, uncooperative, or hard to deal with. But this fear keeps them small, the ones always accepting, always bearing the weight, always exhausted, yet afraid to speak up. You can't blame others for demanding too much if you've never told them you have limits. You can't expect understanding if you've never made clear what's acceptable and what's not. And you can't preserve self-respect if every time you have a chance to protect it, you choose silence just to save someone else's face. Self-respect isn't innate. It's the result of repeated actions where you choose clarity over comfort. The Stoics understood that kindness cannot endure without boundaries. They didn't teach us to say no out of hatred, but to say no from a deep understanding of the value of our time, energy, and mind. A firm no can be the most loving act, not toward others, but toward yourself. Because if you don't have the power to say no, then even your yes becomes meaningless. We often confuse being available with being too easy, caring with appeasing, patience with self-harm. But these are not the same. You can be warm and still have limits. You can help others and still say, "I can't take on more." You can be kind without allowing yourself to be taken for granted. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself each day, "Today, I will meet the selfish, the rude, the ungrateful." But he never said we must tolerate them unconditionally. He simply emphasized, don't let them change who you are, and to do that, you must have boundaries. Boundaries are where you end and the world begins. They don't make you cold, they make you trustworthy. Because only when you know what you will not allow can others learn to respect you, and only then can you live without trading your dignity for peace. In a world where kind people are often seen as pushovers, setting boundaries isn't a choice. It's a duty. A duty to yourself, to your mind, to the peace you fought to preserve through so many trials. Stoics don't draw lines because they're afraid of pain. They draw lines because they know they deserve to live with respect from others and from themselves. 6. When kindness becomes a silent contract, there are people who live their entire lives without ever raising their voice, never objecting, never causing disruption. They're the friend who always listens, the colleague who always takes on the hard part, the obedient child, the gentle partner. On the surface, they are the image of kindness, patient, calm, polite. But if you ask how they feel behind closed doors, when no one needs them to play the good person anymore, you might see the truth. They are tired, drained, and silent. Not because they are at peace, but because they've grown used to not being allowed to speak. Kindness, when repeated without self-awareness or conscious choice, becomes an unspoken contract. I won't make things difficult, and in return, you won't reject me. I won't push back as long as you let me exist in your eyes as someone agreeable. But like all compromises rooted in fear, this contract has a hidden cost. The more you give kindness as compliance, the more people expect you to stay that way. And when you finally have your own needs, your own limits, or simply want to rest, they won't understand. They may even feel betrayed. We often start these roles early. From a young age, we are told not to argue with adults, not to cause trouble, not to talk too much, not to upset anyone. We learn to suppress frustration, to be silent for the sake of manners, to swallow our needs to keep the peace. Over time, what began as a survival strategy becomes a way of life. And at some point, we're no longer sure if we're kind because we choose to be, or because we've forgotten how to be anything else in a world full of expectations. At that point, kindness is no longer a voluntary act. It's a reflex for survival. Epictetus once said, "No one can harm you without your consent." But when you use kindness as a shield to avoid all confrontation, you're giving others that very power. Because you stay silent when disrespected. You don't push back when your time is exploited. You don't walk away from harmful relationships for fear of being seen as harsh. And each time you do this, you're not just silencing your voice. You're renewing the same old contract. I'll keep quiet. Just let me continue to exist in your eyes as a good person. But the truth is, you cannot build self-respect on self-erasure. Kindness without choice, without limits, without the courage to say no, is not virtue, but a contract of submission. That's when people begin to see you as someone who never refuses, the one who always takes the load, the one who understands and never gets upset. They're not wrong. They're simply following the cues you gave them, every time you bit your tongue, every forced smile you offered. Kindness becomes a burden when it's not born from intention, but from the fear of being disliked, rejected, or seen as difficult. And that fear turns every negative emotion into silence, every personal boundary into self-correction, every justified reaction into endurance. That's not kindness, that's emotional servitude in a moral disguise. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself each morning that he would meet the selfish, the rude, the ungrateful, the wicked, but he didn't write that he must endure them all. What he taught was, do not let their nature change your own. And to do that, you must know the difference between calm, born of choice, and numbness, born of depletion. You must be brave enough to say no, not with anger, but with clarity. You must be alert enough to realize that it's not your job to keep everyone comfortable, especially when the price is your own disappearance. A healthy relationship is never built on one person's silence. A respectful environment never demands you shrink to be accepted. And a person who lives true to Stoic values will never sign a moral contract that requires them to erase their boundaries, their feelings, their needs, or their reason, just to be allowed to belong. 7. Don't trade respect for comfort. There is a steep price many people pay each day without realizing it. The price of constantly trying to be pleasant. They speak softly while boiling inside. They agree to things that contradict their values. They laugh when they want to cry, stay silent when they're hurt, and nod when every instinct screams to push back. All to keep the atmosphere comfortable, to avoid making others uneasy, to protect the image of being a good person. But in trying to preserve harmony, they are losing the one thing no one should ever trade away: self-respect. The problem isn't in being kind. The problem begins when kindness becomes a mask for fear. The fear of rejection, of being misunderstood, of being criticized, of being isolated. And to avoid those things, people begin to dull their opinions, soften their reactions, shrink their sense of worth. They believe that if they're likable, approachable, agreeable, then others will love them, but they forget one truth. People can like you without respecting you. And when they don't respect you, they may still smile, but they won't hesitate to step over you when it suits them. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Don't waste any more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one." But he never said a good person must always go along, always be liked, always make others feel comfortable. On the contrary, he lived like a rock against the sea, steady, unmoved, not easily blurred by public expectation. He understood that goodness without principle is an invitation for contempt. He knew that respect doesn't come from pleasing everyone, but from living with clarity, firmness, and an unwillingness to compromise with what is wrong, even in silence. Epictetus also reminded us, "No one can harm you unless you allow it." And one of the ways we unknowingly allow others to harm us is by constantly yielding to be accepted. Every time you stay silent when you should speak, you're telling yourself that someone else's comfort matters more than your dignity. Every time you agree just to smooth things over, you're making your own voice smaller inside your own mind. And at some point, you won't even realize when your boundaries disappeared, only that you feel invisible, drained, and lost in the very relationships you worked so hard to maintain. The Stoic doesn't live to avoid conflict nor to stir it up. They simply live honestly, speak truthfully, act rightly, and keep their soul from being blurred by compromise. They don't strive to make everyone feel comfortable at all costs, because they know that comfort built on the sacrifice of respect is not lasting. A relationship based on appeasement is fragile because it never allows you to show up as yourself. It demands that you keep an image, keep the peace, keep the role of the good person, even when it makes you betray yourself. Respect does not come from always agreeing. It comes from knowing when to agree and when to decline. It comes from the courage to say no, even when it may disappoint others. It comes from standing by your personal principles in a world that constantly tests them. And above all, it comes from placing truth and integrity above the need to be liked. You can make others happy, but if it costs you your sense of self, it's not goodwill, it's self-betrayal. And each time you betray yourself, you don't just lose a piece of your self-respect. You're also teaching others that you're not worthy of theirs. People don't need you to be harsh, but they do need to see that you have a spine. They don't need you to be rigid, but they must know you won't bend easily. They may never say it, but they always sense who lives by principle. And it is those principles, not your pleasantness, that make you irreplaceable. I used to believe that to be loved, I had to always be kind, always available, always agreeable to everyone. I used to tolerate what was wrong just to keep the peace, used to say yes out of fear of disappointing others, used to smile even when I was hurting, simply because I was afraid of being seen as difficult. But the more I tried to live up to others' expectations, the more hollow I felt inside. Not because I wasn't appreciated, but because I had traded the truth in my heart for silence on the outside. It wasn't until I began setting boundaries, saying no, and living by my own principles without needing approval that I truly began to feel present. I no longer strive to be accepted. I choose to live with clarity, even if it makes some people uncomfortable, because I understand this. If I don't respect myself first, no one else has any obligation to do it for me. If what you've just heard touched something within you, please like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next content. And carry this with you. You don't need anyone's approval to have worth. You just need to live in accordance with your dignity, which nothing can ever take away. I'll see you in the next video.